tonight, the UK and France say they'll support Ukraine unwaveringly. But will Donald Trump? As Starmer joins Macron for Armistice Day, in a show of European solidarity, both leaders are preparing for a new US president. Could Kyiv be forced into a so-called peace deal? There are reports the president-elect has spoken direct to Vladimir Putin and advised the Russian president not to escalate the war in Ukraine. The UK's Defence Secretary says if that's true, it's a very good first step. World leaders have got 70 days until Trump's return to office. We'll ask if the UK's ready and whether it could get caught up in a trade war. Plus, our political editor Beth Rigby has gone back to our target towns of Grimsby and Cleethorpes after 130 days of Starmer in office. How are voters feeling? And after Trump's reported to have told Starmer, "You've got a friend in me," we'll look at whether Labour Prime Ministers and Republican presidents really can get along. Two best friends joining me tonight, Alastair Campbell and Guto Harri, who'll be with us for the next hour. It's Monday, I'm Sophy Ridge, live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. Hello, good evening. Well, on tonight's show, we are talking defence. There's 70 days until Donald Trump enters the White House and the international scramble has begun, whether on trade, tariffs, climate change. Every nation is trying to position and prepare as much as possible. And nowhere is this more true than Ukraine. Donald Trump said he would end the conflict in 24 hours if he became president, but he hasn't said how or on what terms. Well, yesterday, Russia suffered its deadliest day of the war so far. That's according to figures from Ukraine's armed forces. And Moscow fired 145 drones at Ukraine, the biggest nighttime attack of the conflict. You know, with the clock ticking until Trump gets into the White House, time when it comes to the Ukraine conflict appears to have almost sped up. Because at times, it's felt like this is a war in a deep freeze, with Ukraine losing slowly. Allies like the UK and France promising, as they did again today, to support Ukraine unwaveringly and for as long as necessary. But what there hasn't been much talk of is, realistic talk of how this relentless war comes to an end. There's been a lot of conversation about weapons, military strategy, but what is the diplomatic strategy? What is the end game? And what's the plan for what comes after? These are always the difficult questions in war, always the ones we end up ducking and end up paying the price for. History tells us this, but we don't always learn those lessons. Here's Sky's Moscow correspondent Ivor Bennett with tonight's first report.
It is a relationship that Europe is watching with bated breath. Two strongmen who are reportedly talking again. Donald Trump is said to have spoken with Vladimir Putin the day after his election win last week. He apparently urged Russia's leader not to escalate the war in Ukraine. If that's true, it doesn't seem to have worked. Russian air attacks there last night killed 6 people, according to local authorities. Reports, too, of an imminent new offensive. But just when Ukraine needs Western support most, there are fears US aid will be cut once Trump assumes office. Commemorating other wars in Europe, Kyiv's allies remained upbeat. The message from France and Britain: don't jump to conclusions.
I expect a President Trump-led administration to recognise that it is in America's interests, it's in NATO's interests, it's in the interest of all countries that believe in the international rules-based order and a stable and secure peace that Putin does not prevail.
The trouble is, Ukraine's allies aren't the only ones trying to woo the new White House administration. Moscow seems to be too.
The Kremlin's denied the reports of a call, saying they're pure fiction and that Vladimir Putin has no concrete plans to speak with Donald Trump at present. But words and actions don't always align here. Last week, the Kremlin said Vladimir Putin had no plans to congratulate Donald Trump on his election win. But then, of course, he did just that.
And that's not all. He even praised Donald Trump's bravery, apparently hoping flattery will lead to a peace deal in Moscow's favour. But what do Russians think will happen? Will Trump live up to his promise to end the war soon?
Trump, он бизнесмен. Trump is a businessman, so there is a glimmer of hope that he will abandon the military methods of escalation and perhaps the situation in Europe will improve.
This was part of the election campaign. He doesn't control everything himself. There's still a complex political machine.
He is the president of the country that started this all. I think he will support the interests of his country. They were not in our favour from the beginning.
Perhaps the only certainty of the next Trump presidency is that it's impossible to predict. So right now, all sides are hoping for the best. Ivor Bennett, Sky News in Moscow.
Well, after meeting the French president earlier, Keir Starmer is now headed to Azerbaijan for the COP climate change summit. Our deputy political editor Sam Coates has been travelling with the Prime Minister. And Sam, they just landed in Baku, I think. Sam, lots for Keir Starmer to think about on the international stage.
That's right, Sophie. Welcome to the edge of Baku Airport, where in the last hour, Prime Minister Keir Starmer landed to head to that climate change summit. It's 2 days of very intensive diplomacy. He's back travelling the world once again with the spectre of Donald Trump following him every step of the way. The incoming president, I think, has changed the conversation on so many subjects and in so many different ways. Take earlier today, Keir Starmer was seeing President Macron as part of the armistice commemorations. Now, we know that the pair of them spoke about Ukraine, and they reaffirmed, Keir Starmer talking to us on the plane a couple of hours ago, reaffirmed Britain's long-term commitment to Ukraine along with France's long-term commitment. But I've watched Keir Starmer on these plane trips several times, and often he gives away a little bit more than he did today. Sometimes there are hints about maybe greater use of weapons in other more aggressive ways. None of that today. What really struck me from our chat on the plane, Sophie, was the caution with which Keir Starmer was approaching this subject, because I think, bluntly, everybody knows that there are mixed signals coming out of Team Trump about what's going to happen next. Nobody really can be sure, but they are bracing and they are preparing where they can, but it is unclear quite what can be done. But it was quite striking, Sophie, because I think we're at a point where it feels like Keir Starmer is investing more and more in the global stage. He thinks that as important for Britain. We challenged him a bit about just how much time he was spending overseas, just how much time he was on a plane. Was it in Britain's best interest? He was completely bullish about this question. He said there were two priorities more than anything else that he was working towards. The economy, and he's saying that you can do investment deals overseas. And when I asked him, he said that also border security was the other priority. A few weeks ago, he had 5 missions. Now he seems to have 2 priorities. But what he said was it is less important where he is than what he is focusing on. And he is arguing that his engagement with leaders overseas in places like Baku, here tonight at the margins of the COP Climate Change Summit, or next week in Brazil when he goes there for the G20, what he's concentrating in is more important than where he is, because he says all of it helps back voters at home.
OK, thank you very much, Sam Coates. They're travelling with the Prime Minister, currently in Azerbaijan. Well, we started the programme talking about Ukraine and what Donald Trump means for that conflict. We can speak now to the military analyst, Sean Bell. Sean, thank you for being on the programme tonight. I was really keen to speak to you because I guess, like many people, we're kind of trying to work out and grapple with that big question. What do you think a Donald Trump presidency does mean for the Ukraine conflict?
Yeah, good evening, Sophie. I mean, I think we have to put this into context. You look back in history, President Trump, when he last came to power, said he was going to build a wall along the whole of the Mexican border. He was going to solve the Middle East crisis, and he was going to deal with North Korea. None of those actually manifested themselves, but it did give a clear idea of his intent. And its intent around NATO is to make all the countries pay their way. And its intent with regard to Ukraine, as all of his folks are now saying, is more a focus on how to bring the war to an end than an argument about territory. And that fundamentally has been a different approach than the West has taken so far, which largely has been President Zelensky will support you every inch of the way, whatever you decide to do. The problem is, of course, as time has gone by, The Russians have increased their activity relentlessly, particularly in the Donbass region and in the Kursk region over the last few weeks. They're taking massive casualties, but they seem to be making a last push in anticipation of that 20th of January inauguration, in the expectation that President Putin might be prepared to start talking to President Trump with a view to seeing how the war might end, however unpalatable that might be for President Zelensky and potentially the West.
You see, this is it. There'll be some people who think, oh my goodness, this is absolutely terrifying, worrying. Is this going to mean effectively, Ukraine being forced to hand over their territory, Putin being rewarded for this illegal, and awful invasion? Others will be thinking, well, it's been going on for a long time, an awful lot of people are losing. Maybe Donald Trump can do something here. What is your own view on this?
Well, my sense is, Sophie, that if you recall back in spring last year, the West provided a huge amount of weapons and equipment and training because President Zelensky claimed that with the West support, he could push Russia out. That much vaunted spring offensive was delayed, but actually the front lines didn't move much at all. The war chests are largely empty. The West is spinning up. It's providing a lot of financial support and artillery, dumb weapons. But bluntly, there doesn't seem to be a lot else we can do. And despite all of the efforts, Russia is still moving forward. It is the bigger party here. In a war of attrition, it will gradually win. I mean, there's some shocking statistics that the Chief of Defense Staff was saying about Russia, but they're just happy to take those casualties as long as they secure the territory. I think the challenges of any negotiation, if President Trump genuinely believes that he can bring this war to a close, he's got to negotiate with Putin, and therefore Putin has to be incentivized to bring the war to an end. What is it that, given he's on the front foot at the moment, why would he negotiate? But it does seem possible that Trump could actually threaten that America could escalate military support to the conflict. And that's the stick he might use. The carrot he might use is to talk about easing sanctions. My real worry about this, which you alluded to, is that whilst peace might then settle, what on earth does North Korea think about this? What does Iran think about this? And more worrying, how does China interpret this when it looks at Taiwan? Besides, for President Zelensky, the big things will be, how do you pay for rebuilding his country? And secondly, what does security look like for what remains of Ukraine? He won't accept a written guarantee. He had one of those back in 1994, the Budapest memo. Frankly, it wasn't worth the paper it was written on. How will he guarantee the security? And that will be a big issue for the future.
It's really interesting to talk, and you raised some really important issues there. Thank you very much for being on the programme. Right, let's bring in a duo for this evening, shall we? Not one, but two former Downing Street Directors of Communications. We've got Alastair Campbell and Guto Harri. Great to have you both here. Alastair, we're all kind of wrestling with what Donald Trump means for all sorts of things, but I guess Ukraine has got to be one of the top things that many people are going to be worrying about. What's your own sort of take on this?
Well, it's very hard to read because he's... you can't always take him at his word. He says things like, I can sort this out in 24 hours. Well, he and everybody else knows that you can't sort it out in 24 hours. But he's trying to, as Sean said there, trying to give an indication of travel. I think I am genuinely alarmed the extent to which what I would define as pro-Putin, anti-supporting Ukraine people are very, very close in around Trump. Now, his relations with the people around him are not always clear. But I thought it was a very good move today, Macron inviting Keir Starmer. I think Europe's leaders have really got to get their act together in terms of having a clear, coherent strategy that is understood and that none of them are just seen as kind of appendages of the US. Where I don't have much sympathy with Donald Trump on many things, but where I think he has had a point over recent years has been the extent to which Europe has just assumed that American security defence is going to be there forever.
What's your sort of take?
Well, it's very painful to watch, but the truth is at the moment is that it's reached the sort of stalemate in the war, and Russia can afford to take more pain in the end than Ukraine can. And so there's got to be some sort of outcome, and whatever outcome it is going to stick in the throat for a lot of us. So I comfort myself that if there was some sort of deal, if, and it's a big if, as Alastair says, that Donald Trump can somehow, through a combination of threats and cajoling and, whatever else he does, create a situation where he says to Zelensky, you're going to have to just say goodbye once and for all to the Crimea. But the good news is you get to stay as a sovereign, independent, democratic country, and Russia will be put back in its box. Horrendous though it is, the pain that everyone's gone through, it's not the worst outcome. And I remember the briefings, I was present at a lot of them, where we were told that Kyiv would fall in 3 days, Ukraine would be gone in 3 weeks. Ukraine is still standing, Zelensky is still president. They have won. And so however painful it is to do a deal now, in the end, they've seen off an attempt to wipe them off the face of the earth. So if they have to compromise, which you always have to do at the end, it's not the worst compromise in the world if it ends this slaughter.
I think there's one of the things that I think they will insist upon, the Russians, is that Ukraine cannot become a member of NATO. And it's hard, I think, then to see that as a win for Ukraine. I think that would be a really, really difficult thing for them to accept.
So do you think that Ukraine should be a member of NATO then?
Look, Ukraine clearly wants to be part of our security network, as it were, as opposed to under the umbrella of Russia. It was, as you said in your introduction, an illegal invasion of a democratic government, a democratic country. And I worry as well that, we just had last weekend the election in Moldova, tiny little country. And as Sean was saying there that the Budapest Agreement was kind of, he said, not worth the paper it's written on. It certainly had to be kind of adapted because Putin has behaved as he's done. So I think the idea, if Putin can project this as he having won, I think those other countries are going to be sitting there thinking, hold on a minute, are we next?
I mean, what's your take on NATO? Because it splits opinion, doesn't it?
Well, it's awkward, isn't it? Because I don't have any sympathy for Putin at all, but I understand where a country draws a line in the sand and says, I'm sorry, we cannot have a military alliance that NATO is a defensive alliance, but essentially, if you're Russian, you don't want the borders of NATO to be right up on your border. So I understand the anxiety about Ukraine being part of NATO. And I think a lot of people close to this appreciate that that was actually a provocation. Doesn't justify what happened at all. But it was pushing Putin to its limit. It was putting him in a corner, putting him in his cage. So you need to get to a point, I think we need to get to a point where Ukraine feels confident that Russia will not come screaming across the border again. We stopped them once, the world stopped them, and Ukraine is still standing, and thank God for that. But, at some point, we cannot just carry on with slaughter ad infinitum.
You disagree?
I do. I think that anything that allows him to say that he is being rewarded. You used the phrase rewarded for the misery, the pain, the slaughter that he's inflicted. I think is really, really dangerous for the entire region. And I think there's a danger that in what you just said, Guto. I think there's a danger that we're buying his argument. It's, Nigel Farage doing the thing about, well, if you poke the bear, this is what happens. Well, I don't know. I don't think the bear was being poked. The bear decided it wanted to take back Ukraine.
But then I guess the other issue is whether this is a war of attrition. I think, as Sean Bell said, that eventually Ukraine is...
There's no military outcome. There's no military victory here, I don't think, for either side. It's just something that grinds on year after year after year for misery. And, I think that President Zelensky has defined modern leadership, certainly defined modern war leadership. He has heroically defended his country. His country would not exist if it wasn't for him and actually guy I worked for and others who piled in behind him at the time. We've done the heavy lifting on that. At some point, there has to be a sort of kind of cut our losses and take the win that's available.
It's been a really interesting conversation. Thank you. You mentioned the defence spending, which I think is a really important point because, of course, you know, it's expensive backing Ukraine. There are also other big military costs as well against the backdrop of the extremely tight public finances. Well, the government has committed to increasing defence spending to 2.5% of GDP in principle. They haven't said when they'll do it. Let's have a listen to what the Defence Secretary said in the House of Commons today.
Everybody agrees that defence spending must increase. We've got a government commitment that will set a path to spending 2.5% of our national income on defence, and we've made a start. Next year, the budget for the defence will increase by £3 billion, and that's a sign of a government that recognises the first duty of any government is to defend the country and keep our citizens safe.
Well, that clearly wasn't the House of Commons, it was the Ministry of Defence, but other than that. Alastair, you were saying that people need to you have some sympathy with Donald Trump on the issue of countries having to, you know, bump up their defence spending.
Well, you know, we had the budget recently where the big thing was the future of the health service, getting more money into the health service. So when Tony Blair was Prime Minister and Gordon Brown was Chancellor, we were able to put a lot more money into health, in part because the world felt a lot more peaceful than it does now. And I think we're kidding ourselves if we think that we can deliver the sort of security that people feel we need, especially when you see the extent to which our armed forces have been run down, without really understanding that defence spending and our security has to be a priority. So, and I feel sorry for John Healey every time it's, well, when are you going to do it? When are you going to do it? The fact is, the economy does have to grow. They do have all these other priorities. But I think we are facing a period of history where defence and security are back on the agenda the way they weren't for some time.
You say the economy has to grow, but if you look at the projections after the budget, that might not happen for a long time, right? So what needs to happen first?
And it's another debate about whether the measures they're taking are actually going to achieve the polar opposite of growing the economy. They're actually making wealth creation. That's another. We'll talk about it many times, but we do have to sort of front load defence spending. Alastair's absolutely right. The world is far more dangerous. A few years ago, we weren't thinking, what do we need the 3% for? What would we buy? And where would we put whatever we've bought in order to sort of see off who? These days, God, you can do a long list of places in the world where our interests are under threat. And you can design a frightening number of scenarios where we are directly involved in a conflict that is really, really serious for us, not just our interest. And in that sense, we've got to just find the money and put it there. And that means not paying train drivers 15%. Don't want to do a cheap shot. But there are priorities in government that you have to change according to the climate at the time. Climate at the time, I cannot think of the world having been more dangerous than it is at the moment.
I also think there has to be, which again, to go back to the Macron thing, you know, Britain, France, Germany, Poland, there are still some pretty serious military powers in Europe. They've really got to work together as well. They've got to work together much more closely than they've done in the past.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we did over the Ukraine. A lot of them were very slow out of the, they were very reluctant initially. Germany were, France were, lots of good reasons in many ways. But in the end, they did all pile in. And when Biden piled in and America piled in with its money and its weapons, it changed the dynamics there. But I think Britain took the lead there. At the moment, we need everyone involved. And Donald Trump clearly is not going to sort of make up for what we're not paying for ourselves.
I mean, this is it, isn't it? The Donald Trump presidency, and you're right, we don't really know what that entails yet. We're kind of assuming. But we do know what he said about Europe on defence. We know that he instinctively is not someone who wants to pile a lot of American money into conflict abroad. Do you think that the Labour government now needs to, I guess, bring its defence spending forward to front load it, as Guto said?
You can only sort of commit to what you can afford, but I think in terms of indicating a direction of travel, I think that's what John Healey was trying to do today. Look, I think the thing about Donald Trump, you said in your introduction, virtually every conversation between the leaders is going to be about what do you think Donald Trump's going to do. Europe, climate, Ukraine, Middle East. I mean, the guy now is just such a big player within it. It's very, very hard to work out. I think when we had, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Obama, you could work out, you had a very good sense of what they would do. Very difficult to work that out with Trump. So in the meantime, what the British government and other governments have to be doing is actually preparing for all sorts of eventualities, but also understanding their own role in their own foreign policy. And so I don't think we should get overly spooked by Trump. Diplomacy's got to carry on. You've got to work with these governments. Every single government in the world is working out how to deal with Donald Trump right now.
Yeah.
And I think from our perspective, we are probably in a stronger position than most countries. So I wouldn't worry too much about when you're going to put the money in. But what I do think we need to be clear that European security is going to be much more dependent on Europe.
I think we do need a sense of urgency, because it's not about direction of travel. It's not about the sort of show of, what you believe is important. It's about, weapons. It's about tanks. It's about men and women on the ground. If you go and see the British troops in Estonia, for instance, they are there because the Russians could come over the border and they could come charging towards them, and they stopped them with NLAW missiles, which were used. We gave virtually 80% of our supplies of NLAW missiles to the Ukraine, which stopped the Russian advance. They need to be replenished. That's money that needs to be handed over now to a factory in Belfast and to a company in Sweden in order to get more of those things to the troops on the ground in Estonia. This is not one of those woolly sort of North London sort of direction of travel, we're all there. That money needs to be spent today, so the missiles are there next.
I don't know, we did have a budget a couple of weeks ago.
And there was none of that. There was a lot of other stuff.
Spending review next.
Thanks very much indeed. Good to chat. Well, of course, the consequences of Donald Trump and the war in Ukraine sure to feature in tomorrow's newspapers. We'll have our extended press preview from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us will be the political editors of The Sun and The Guardian, Harri Cole and Pippa Creer. You're watching The Politics Hub. Coming up. Politicians this side of the Atlantic go on and on about the special relationship, but is it really still a thing? Well, Keir Starmer really hopes so. And Sky News returns to Grimsby to see what voters there make of Keir Starmer's performance as Prime Minister so far. Plus, as Donald Trump declares tariff is my favourite word, we look at the potential cost a protectionist presidency could have for the UK.
What's it like doing this kind of stuff when he's not here?
Yeah, I miss him. He just inspired me to be a better person. He's shown us what living looks like in the toughest and most difficult of circumstances.
I'm Greg Milam, and I'm Sky's Chief North of England correspondent.
Mandatory evacuation, you must leave!
For many people, Harvey is far from over.
People here believe the water will be this deep for weeks.
I've reported from around the world and around the UK.
It isn't what politicians see from election battle buses, but what ordinary people see from the buses that shape the timetable of their lives.
I feel like there's no trust between the people and the politicians.
Labour's going to get in definitely, and they're no better than the Conservatives.
It is almost impossible to predict where these fires will go next.
Ida has certainly left its mark on New Orleans.
It just feels heartbreaking.
Cartels in Mexico are flooding America with the drug.
We are standing on the supply line right into the heart of America's opioid crisis. This gives you an idea of the strength of those winds, strong enough to bend and twist metal. Sky News, the full story first. Christchurch has been changed forever by what happened here.
There was a river of blood coming out of the mosque. That's a scene that you don't forget.
Are you trying to run me over, Sir Philip?
No, go away.
Look like it, sir. Will you respond to those who made accusations, Sir Philip?
Can you go away?
Very good morning to you all.
Morning. Do you regret the tweet, Gary?
There's no sign, publicly at least, of either side being willing to give ground.
Brianna's dad told Sky News what he thinks of them.
If I'm honest, I hate them. They're just evil. They'll always be monsters.
Free wherever you get your news. How do you reassure the public that all of these mistakes wouldn't be made again?
God forbid we should have to do this again.
We arrive. A secret hospital hidden in the Myanmar jungle, treating the victims of this bloody war. This is Myanmar today. Its military rulers don't want the world to see, but we have.
I fight for my own future. I fight for my generation futures.
This is an actual crime.
They don't care for that.
Myanmar army is only a couple of kilometres away.
So this is a major humanitarian disaster.
Hello, welcome back. Some breaking news to bring you from the world of football, because Sky News understands that Gary Lineker is leaving Match of the Day at the end of the season. However, he will stay on to present the BBC's 2026 Men's World Cup coverage. So that news that Gary Lineker deciding to leave Match of the Day at the end of the season. We can go to our sports correspondent, Rob Harris, now. Rob, this is big news. What more can you tell us?
It is. Gary Lineker's presented Match of the Day since 1999, a face of football for so many, but Sky News does understand that this will be Gary Lineker's last season presenting Match of the Day. He is due to continue presenting live coverage of the FA Cup and indeed the 2026 Men's World Cup for the BBC. He also might have other future projects with them still, but confirming a report first in The Sun that Gary Lineker is to stand down from the show that so many they've spent their lives watching, with him presenting the Premier League highlights on a Saturday night. Now, of course, he very controversially did not present one episode last year when he was taken off the air for criticising the then government's policy on immigration. It led to a huge storm, with various presenters and commentators also refusing then to take part in the BBC's coverage, leading to the silencing a lot of their coverage that weekend. And that really reflected some of the friction perhaps within the BBC towards its star presenter, particularly his very political tweets that would run into conflict with some of the BBC's social media policies, according to some. So that caused issue as well during the Euros just now in Germany in the summer. His criticism of the England team on his own podcast also created some concern, apparently, in and around football, as Lineker was presenting coverage on the BBC separately. And it's actually his growing podcast business, which is one of the reasons why he actually has quite a bright future beyond Match of the Day. He's built up Goalhanger Productions over the years, which now produces some of the biggest podcasts in the country, not just, of course, on football, the rest is football, but also the rest is politics, the rest is history. They are amongst the top podcasts in the country, making Gary Lineker a fortune, and that is a business he'll be focusing on. But from next season, the BBC will be needing a new presenter of its flagship Match of the Day programme. So many names will obviously start to be discussed in-house. They have the likes of Mark Chapman and Gabby Logan as well. There's also Kelly Cates, who's a potential contender to be the next Match of the Day presenter as well. But a big decision for the BBC, and for many, a figure who's been quite divisive, but certainly someone who's turned a hugely successful footballing career for England, Tottenham Hotspur and Barcelona into a stellar one, presenting football on the BBC.
Rob, thank you very much indeed. I mean, such a familiar face. It's almost hard to kind of really separate football, watching football on TV and Gary Lineker. It's extraordinary. Alastair, I couldn't help noticing that Rob Harris is saying he's going to spend a bit more time focusing on his growing podcast portfolio, including the rest of politics. You're going to have him on the phone a bit more now. It's going to be...
No, listen, Gary's a great guy, and he has been. I think he's a fantastic he was a great footballer. He and I went to the same school, bizarrely.
Did you actually?
City Leicester Boys, yeah. He's a little bit younger than I am. But is he younger or older? Yeah, he's younger. So, but I think he's going to be a very, very hard act to follow. I think he sees me as his natural successor. I think that's why...
What, on Match of the Day?
I think so.
Are you going to do a job swap?
As long as I'm allowed to wear my Burnley ties, he'll I don't know, he's got his rest his football.
You can see Gary Lineker and Rory Stewart on Wrestlers Politics, then you go into the Match of the Day studio. I cannot see Rory
Stewart on Match of the Day, that's for sure. But no, I think he'll be a very, very hard act to follow. He's an excellent broadcaster and a very good guy.
And you obviously used to work for the BBC, Guto. How much he was such a big beast at the BBC, wasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, clearly he had untouchable credibility as a footballer. I know nothing about football, but clearly he was top drawer, and as a broadcaster, second to one. But an interesting phenomenon, people end up, when they outgrow the BBC in a way, and I don't mean that as an insult to the BBC, because the BBC is right to demand 100% commitment to political neutrality, which I gave in the 20 years I was there, and he needs to give. And I see him straining at the leash, and maybe he needs freedom, not just to sort of interfere a bit more with The Rest is Politics and The Rest is History, which is currently my favourite podcast of all time.
It's a great podcast.
But also to just be Gary Lineker. And he's perfectly entitled, outside the BBC, to say what he thinks about immigration policy, what he thinks about different states in the Middle East. But he can't do that and present a flagship BBC programme. So I wish him well in a world where he will now have more freedom to be Gary Lineker and step up, go into politics even if he wants to.
Yeah, do you agree with that then? Do you think he's straining at the leash, Guto described it?
I think Guto was a political correspondent. I think we've got to be careful.
You trusted me while I was there, didn't you?
Up to a point. But
he used to brief me.
But the thing about
this is really getting interesting now.
The thing about Gary Lineker as a political figure, I think he strikes me as somebody who does have strong views about a lot of really important issues. I think the BBC went a little bit too far with things. I think if you're a comedian or if you're a sports presenter, it's not the same as being a political reporter. But I suspect he is feeling, and also he's done it a long time. In 1999, my God, that's a long time to do the same thing, schlepping up to Manchester every Saturday, watching the games with Alan Shearer and Ian Wright all day long, and then. But I think he's one of the best broadcasters. And by the way, he's the first to admit, I think, that at the start, I think he really found it very, very difficult.
Really?
But I think he's morphed into being one of our
25
best
years on.
broadcasters. 25 years, yeah.
Who do you want to see taken over, Match of the Day?
You didn't take me seriously when I said what I said.
Oh, no, I didn't, sorry.
Okay,
and I know so little about football that I'm happy to endorse that.
Let's
start the campaign now.
Get Burnley live on Match of the Day every day. First match.
And then I'll join Rory on his podcast.
Yeah, we'll have to get back in the Premier League. I like the idea of Kelly Cates. I think a woman would be good.
Yeah.
Sophie.
Well, never know.
Right.
Never know.
Yeah.
My problem is I have Sheffield Wednesday as the first match every time as well. I'm not sure that.
I actually think it should be somebody who has played football at the highest level, genuinely at the highest level, because that's what the audience are entitled to, not somebody who ticks a box or fills a...
Does that include women footballers then?
Of course it does. But actually, to be fair, if you compare record for record, the length of time you've played, the level at which you played, your achievements in that, women are still playing catch-up just because they were held back for a while.
Yeah, but hold on a minute. That's like saying political correspondents should have been politicians.
It's not, actually. I think it's
also,
different.
I think the presenter's a bit different.
I think it's different with sport. I think it's every member of the audience knows a lot about it. So what they need is somebody they have...
No, they think they know a lot.
So much credibility.
Talk to Sean Dyche about how much fans know.
You do a half-decent job, but you want somebody who's been there. And it could be a woman, but,
Could be Alastair Campbell, heard it here first. Right, we've got a bit distracted there with all the football chat, but let's get back to our main topic of conversation tonight. Donald Trump, what does it mean? Just want you to take a quick listen to what the President-elect said on tariffs.
To me, the most beautiful word in the dictionary is tariff, and it's my favourite word.
His favourite word, there you have it, his favourite word.
I think we know what his favourite
tariffs.
word is. It does begin with T, but it's not tariff, it's Trump.
Oh, I was wondering where you're going then. I was trying to work it out.
Yeah.
Guto, what's your sense? Do you think his kind of big talk on tariffs is kind of rhetoric, trying to almost like a kind of negotiating tactic, or do you think he's serious?
I have to hope that it's playing to the gallery, because actually the reality of it, and normally it's people on the hard left who think that tariffs and interfering with the global movement of trade is a good idea. It's not a good idea in the end, because if you do it to somebody else, they do it to you, and before you know it, everybody's paying more for their goods. And one of the reasons, arguably the main reason he's got elected, is because people are feeling the pinch in the household budget. And some of the goods they buy, even in the States, come from other countries. And if he slaps 20% on them, that's 20% on the household budget. So it's not a good idea for his own supporters. For the world, it's a really bad idea. For our relationship with America, if he starts slapping 20% on everything we send out there, whoa, that's not going to help. It's not going to help growth.
I mean, there's some people who say, look, this could be a big benefit of Brexit. This is time for the UK to get in there, get the free trade deal with the US, and then, there's some... come on, Alastair. I've teed you up.
We're both on the same side.
I mean, it's now what? We're 8 years in.
It's not happening.
I'm still to see one of these benefits flying around. I haven't seen any yet. I see that's a line that they're running, that, you know, this will enable us to make one of the great trade deals that Johnson was going to deliver and never did. Look, I think we've got to be very wary about tariffs. What I found extraordinary in America was, and this is the power of Donald Trump's kind of, you know, this unique way he has of communicating, talking to people who genuinely believed him when he said that if he put tariffs on China, that China, it would mean that China would have to pay more. And they believe it. And so I think there's a big job to be done, a job of sort of global education about the real impact of tariffs. I wouldn't be surprised if at some point he does come and maybe try to do a bit of divide and rule between UK and the rest of Europe. I don't know, but no, I think the tariffs thing. And by the way, I'd read the other day that in addition to was he talking about 60% on China, he's got an obsession apparently with Mercedes in Germany, that he's always banging on about them. But also he's talking about if China looks like it's going for Taiwan, he's talking about 200% tariffs. So these are, I don't know, these are just numbers.
Actually, to be serious, because it hits the household budget if it's something you have to buy from abroad. But if the relative cost of buying an American car versus buying a Chinese car, a European car, is distorted by the way China, for instance, has played its currency, then I have some sympathy for him in leveling the playing field so that US manufacturers can compete with China, see them off, and create a situation where it's not a no-brainer for the average American family to buy the cheap Chinese imitation rather than the American original. If he manages to do that, he is safeguarding jobs in the US, then he's safeguarding pay in the US, and they can afford to take a slight hit. That's what if he's serious about this, that's how it works. But it's a very, very dangerous thing to play with.
Well, everyone, of course, trying to embrace, encourage, preserve their relationship with Donald Trump. We know he's an Anglophile. He says he has a special regard for the royal family, and we could be about to discover the extent of that soft power.
Look, here's now the king. Here's Charles with the guard. And this is the Queen, Queen Elizabeth. It's a piece of history at the highest level. Look, it's Charles. So beautiful. And they'll see the most beautiful places in the world. There are no places like this. And hopefully he's going to be well, because he's a really good person. Camilla is fantastic.
So beautiful. I'm not sure who was describing Charles there.
It sounded like he was having a bromance with our king.
When we were doing the podcast in New York, and Anthony Scaramucci was with us, and he was explaining that if you want to brief Donald Trump about something, you have to have pictures, and preferably pictures in which he is in the picture. So you
good tip there. That's what Keir Starmer needs to do. Get a little photo album of Donald Trump.
You know. But I also think that he talks about this sort of great admiration for the Queen. But if you remember, he walked in front of her. You're not meant to do that. Don't you remember? He walked right in front of her. There's the Queen. What's going on here?
I do remember this.
I don't know.
Do you think we should be rolling out the red carpet, another state visit?
Yes, I mean, however, and I'm on the record for better, you know, we can all retreat now and sort of pretend we didn't say things. Thankfully, I'm not Foreign Secretary, because his words really are a handicap for us, but I have described him as odious, ridiculous, all the above. However, he is clearly the choice of the American people in a democratic election where the kitchen sink was thrown at him and he's emerged. And so we welcome him like we welcome everybody else, but more so because we also do have special ties, I guess, with him.
What do you reckon, state visit?
I'd be very surprised if there isn't one sometime in the next Parliament. I think that what's really interesting, though, when he was, when he was president last time around and Theresa May was Prime Minister, and just as it's hard to imagine Keir and Trump sort of having a big bromance, likewise, there was no personal chemistry between those two. So what Theresa May did, I think, was just to make sure the relationship's working at every level. It's not just about the people at the top. The people at the top are incredibly important, yes, but actually there's an awful lot of stuff that goes on beneath that. And I think we've just got to be grown up about this. Trump is the president, whether we like it or not. He's always about him. He's always craving the attention. He's always sort of making the weather. And we've just got to, keep our own national interest front of mind.
So would you change David Lammy? And would you send Peter Mandelson to Washington?
Well, I'll tell you, the thing about David Lammy, and he said a few things, is, J.D. Vance called him Hitler. So I just don't think that matters. Trump's surrounded by this stuff his whole life. So I think David Lammy's doing a good job as Foreign Secretary, and that's more important. So I certainly wouldn't get rid of David Lammy because he said a few things in the past about Donald Trump.
And Peter Mandelson?
Well, I think Karen Pierce, who's there now, is a very good ambassador. And I'm sure there are lots of people that could replace her. So I'm not going to get into the current briefing game that's going on.
Very, very diplomatically put. Nice stir.
Well said. I might say more on the podcast tomorrow.
Thanks both very much. Now, we've talked an awful lot about Donald Trump and also the international challenges for Keir Starmer on the programme so far. But of course, it's the domestic issues that voters are likely to ultimately judge him on. Can people afford to get by? What's the state of the NHS? Do people feel better or worse off? Our political editor, Beth Rigby, has travelled back to Grimsby, one of our target towns, to see what voters there make of the PM's performance so far.
Grimsby and Cleethorpes on the Humber Estuary, home to Sky News' election target towns, and a seat that helped tip the balance for Keir Starmer on the 5th of July. The Labour victory here was a big symbolic win, but the biggest story on the night for Labour was that their vote was as shallow as it was wide. And what I mean by that is, even though Keir Starmer won this massive majority, he did so on the lowest vote share of any government since 1945. All of this might go some way to explaining why this new government is having something of a shaky start. Welcome to Grimsby Town Hall, where we're joined tonight by the two men vying for the keys to Downing Street, Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. Sharon, hi. It's so nice to see you again. Thank you for coming along. So we're back to catch up with some of the voters who put their questions at the Sky News Leaders event. Sharon, Cayman and Amy. A few months in, Keir Starmer's first budget's finally given the contours of Labour's plans, and it's not exactly as advertised before people went to the polls.
No tax rises in the next Parliament.
No tax rises needed in the plans in our manifesto.
In the plans.
No tax rises for working people.
Lifelong Labour voter Sharon wanted to know if Starmer really wouldn't put up taxes in order to invest.
As someone born and bred in Grimsby, I'm proud of our town. How will Labour address these inequalities and improve outcomes for the most disadvantaged residents?
We need a growth plan for Grimsby, which your fingerprints are on.
How it's all going to be funded? If tax is not going up, how are you going to fund it?
We need to put money and resource into Grimsby. We need resource decision-making to come.
That was the question, Sharon, wasn't it? How are you going to fund it?
Yeah, absolutely. And following the budget, I actually think I've been indirectly taxed.
As a working person, you still feel you're going to be paying indirectly for these tax rises? You feel that?
Absolutely. I absolutely do.
Feel that.
And the fear is, and I'm hoping because it feels like a gamble, because he says it's all dependent on growth. And I did vote Labour. I've always voted Labour.
Yeah.
But the Labour I'm seeing so far, there's been so much... It's felt chaotic.
Amy, former chair of her local Conservative Party, couldn't bring herself to vote for Rishi Sunak. Trust was her #1 concern.
In this election, I find myself an undecided voter. Actions taken by this government actually make me feel ashamed. How do you plan to rebuild the public's trust in you, or is it already irreparable?
This election, as you said, you're undecided. And this election is about the future and the future that you want for our country.
Trust. So this is still a big issue for you?
Huge issue, yeah, absolutely. I don't think this government has covered themselves in glory, particularly with trust.
The budget, do you think that Keir Starmer has kept true to the promises he made in this room, or how do you feel about that?
For me, it's more the, he said there in Sharon's question, I think, about the growth. He wants to bring the growth into the country, which is absolutely what is needed. How have we done that? By, putting the burden on businesses to grow. That's just not there.
For Cayman, a question foreshadowing the concerns that have plagued the early days of Starmer's premiership. A PM without the human touch, struggling to give voters a vision to justify the tough choices.
Over the last year, I feel like you've fallen into more of a politician than the person that I would have voted for to run the country. You seem more like a political robot.
Well, For most of...
Is he loosened up a bit since Cayman?
I don't think so.
No?
No, I think he's, you know, anyone that's human who has a heart wouldn't have cut the winter fuel allowance for pensioners. I feel like he's still a robot, yeah.
Still robotic.
Still robotic, yeah.
Cayman voted Lib Dems. Any regret?
No, not necessarily. Labour's still got the majority, but I agree with what you were saying. The message in it almost feels like a bit of a punishment, rather than we all know that we need to chip in. You know, our public services, if we want a result, we're going to have to pay more. But it comes back to the point around the messaging. Nobody's put that in messaging. Nobody's laid that out for the ordinary person.
The jury's still very much out on this new government after a budget that came as a surprise to many voters and to the Labour MP who won this seat for Starmer.
In the days after the budget, a huge investment in the NHS, but also taxes going up for small businesses in Grimsby. Were you surprised by it?
I was, which I've been told not to keep saying that I was surprised.
Why were you surprised, though? Was it because of the enormity of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a very bold budget, and I welcome a bold budget because I think, you know, it's a Labour government and we need to be bold and we need to do everything that we can to try and turn things around as quickly as possible, and that means investment.
It's been a difficult start for Starmer, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think you'd be, you know, a bit blind to say that you hadn't seen a bit of a rocky start.
This piece of the Red Wall won back, but never before has a political landslide stood on such shaky ground. Starmer gambling that his big budget will, in time, pay off and persuade voters about him and his government. Beth Rigby, Sky News, Great Grimsby.
Well, we've got a new guest on the show, our chief political correspondent, John Craig, who's been kind of delving through the archives, looking at relationships between Labour politicians in the UK and Republicans in the States. But before we get on to that, I just wanted to get a bit of your reaction to what we heard from those voters in Grimsby. Is it fair to say, Alastair, that it's been a bit of a bumpy start for the Labour government?
Yeah, I thought Keir started really well. Handled the riots well, but I think the riots did knock them off course a bit. Then that whole freebie thing, which just sort of felt bad, and then into, you know, I think the problem was the budget, the gap between the election and the budget. I just think it was too long. The winter fuel payment, and it was interesting. One of the people there said, I think that felt like it came out of a clear blue sky. But I still think Keir Starmer's got. I was doing an event earlier today, and I asked the audience, who do you think is going to win the next election? I think people still feel the Labour... I think there's still a lot of goodwill for them. I'd like to see much more clarity of strategy. I'd like to... I think if you actually ask people, you know, what's the government for, what's it trying to do? And interesting, Keir said there that, you know, or Sam Coates said that Keir was saying that his big two were growth and immigration. Well, the budget was growth and the health service. You know, you've got to have a real clear message about what the government's for.
Do you agree with that?
I think it's been an astonishingly bad start. I didn't want to see them start that badly, but it has been. And I think what is clear already is that the Conservatives understandably lost the election. Labour did not win the argument, and they certainly did not win the argument for the kind of budget we had last week, which is doing the polar opposite of encouraging growth.
Interesting. Maybe interesting pitch for both of you for a director of comms job, if the sort of strategy...
I don't agree with the last bit, by the way. I don't agree with the last bit, by the way.
No, that's very fair.
I think John Craig would be a good comms guy.
Yeah, he would be excellent.
I have been tipped as a spin doctor for every political
Well, you are
party.
a spin doctor. You're a journalist. We all know the real spin doctors are the journalists.
John, we've got you on because John's written a lovely piece for the Sky website, actually, that I read this morning about the relationships between Labour Prime Ministers and Republicans over in the United States and how they've managed to kind of bond or not.
I mean, you'd think perhaps that Tories would get on with Republicans and Labour with Democrats, but often it's the other way round. Alastair will recall the famous Camp David news conference when George Bush suddenly announced they both used the same toothpaste. and Tony Blair, I remember, very quickly said, "Oh, people are going to know how we know that, George." But Blair and Bush, of course, went to war together. I mean, it was the beginning of the end for Mr. Blair, in my view, because he was vilified by the left. left, and of course he was out a few years later. But then in the previous, I mean, you go right back to Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, wasn't it, in the Second World War? Tory getting on with a Republican. Their common bond was cigars. They were both big cigar smokers. So you got cigars, and you've got toothpaste in the case of Blair and Bush. With Cameron and Obama, Conservative and Democrat, it was burgers. Do you remember they flipped burgers in the... Right, there you are, there's the burgers, yes, in the back garden of number 10. And later, Mr Cameron and his family went to a Five Guys burger restaurant in Solihull on the way back because Barack Obama had recommended this burger chain to Cameron. I mean, then you got examples where the Democrats and the Labour politician didn't get on too well. You've got Wilson clashing with Lyndon Johnson over Vietnam, and then you had we had Harold Macmillan, a bit of a stuffy old Tory toff, if you like, got on brilliantly with JFK, the Democrat, flamboyant, charismatic. And even after the Kennedy assassination, apparently Macmillan got on well with the glamorous Jackie Onassis, apparently. So it doesn't necessarily follow that a Democrat and a Labour politician will get on better than the opposing parties, if you like. And I reckon if Macmillan and Kennedy can hit it off, then I think Mr Sir Keir Starmer can probably come to some sort of agreement, a deal, which the President loves, with President Trump. I mean, they had that dinner up in Trump Tower, and David Lammy got offered a second portion of chicken, despite all the things David Lammy said about the president.
Any tips from you guys? I mean, you've seen, I know, your own premiers up and close and personal in these relationships.
I was just reflecting on this weird thing that blue is the colour of the right here and the left there, the left to this end, and red the other way around. And I wonder if that's the explanation. There's something, I don't know.
I can remember we were with Bill Clinton at Warwick University, who was on a sort of farewell tour to the world, when Tony Blair had his first phone call with George Bush, and it was an amazing moment because Clinton knew Tony had to go and take this phone call because power was moving. And Tony would, you can see that Tony would have said that getting on with the American president, whoever he or she may be, or she may be, was an important part of the job, and you've got to work at it. And Keir Starmer would have to do that.
Well, it was a special relationship, that phrase, that British politicians use more than Americans. It was Churchill said that in a speech when an event with Harry Truman, who was a Democrat.
A great wrestler through history. I want to put you on the spot because you've got an interesting text message. Can you share it with us? Well,
it's just that, people are obviously taking me presenting Match of the Day more serious than you are. So Tony Pastor, who is the boss of Goalhanger, which is Gary's podcast firm, Rest is Politics, by the way, is better than all of them, especially the Rest is Football. He says you could present Match of the Day in your underpants when Burnley win the league, which I will happily do that. I will happily do that.
I think we're quite safe.
You'll do it. Is that a guarantee? If you get the job, if Burnley win, there we go. You heard it here first. Great to have you here. Up next tonight is the UK Tonight.